next philosophy pop-up. Today I thought we would talk about tips for students, stuff that has to do with, could be high school, I guess, although I don't teach high school, mostly university, college level stuff. Yeah, I've been teaching for about 20 years now this year, and I have probably taught thousands of students at this point. I have over 100 this semester alone. So I thought I would open things up once I talk just about a few tips for students to questions and comments about, philosophy in general, how to study philosophy, what to do when you get bogged down writing a paper, for example, or you've got a teacher who's not particularly helpful. David writes, put that stoicism patience to practice. Well, I think all of you know I'm not a stoic, right? I'm an eclectic. So, yeah, this is stuff that we actually should have some control over, and finally did figure out what was going on with it. Turns out that there were some programs running in the background that shouldn't have been running. All right, so I see a question already coming up from Ravi. Trying to work on the philosophy of time. How important is it that I study temporal logic? It depends, on what you're going to study. There's not a lot of material out there, as far as I know, on temporal logic. So I can't say all that much about that, but you would definitely want to study a lot of different philosophers and their viewpoints on time and its relation with other things. It's a major metaphysical issue. Let's jump in and talk about more general stuff. So this is the time of year here in the United States, at least. I'm not sure what it's like in other places, where students are starting to have to work on bigger picture assignments, and papers are starting to pile up. You're getting hopefully some prep for your final examinations, because classes are actually going to end at a lot of places in late April or in early May. So it's important, I think, as a student to start looking at what you actually have to do. And this is where, for example, time management would become quite important. Sketching out what sort of steps you need to do in order to stay on track. Because, as you get to closer and closer to the end and the projects get bigger and bigger, you wind up having less and less time to work on things, especially if you haven't stayed on top of things up until that point. So this is the time when you want to get as much information from your instructors as possible about, what papers ought to look like, or projects ought to incorporate, how many steps there are. If you have, an electronic course management system, which most colleges and universities do, you want to start, checking all of your grades and finding out whether there's anything that you missed that you need to make up, or, whether an instructor didn't grade something that they're supposed to. You want to download all the assignment sheets and grading rubrics. Start thinking about if there's a final examination, how do you actually prepare for the final examination? Those are the things that students are usually going to be concerned with. And a lot of people put that off to the last 2 weeks of class. I would say the last 6 weeks of a class, you want to be asking yourself those questions and getting into that. John Ortiz says, do you have any tips for writing well in philosophy? Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is there is no recipe for doing good writing. It depends very much on the kind of production or genre that you're working in. So writing a conference paper is different than writing an academic article, is different than writing a summary, is different than writing a dialogue. So you want to be very attentive to what is being asked for and what sort of format you're supposed to put things in. That is something that I would say you want to check in with your instructor about. Because if you have somebody who is very used to doing analytic philosophy, they want papers to look a certain way. If you have somebody who's much more interested in continental philosophy or the history of philosophy, they will want papers to be done in different ways than that, right? And so, you know, when you're a student, it's not really your job to try to teach your teacher about how a paper ought to be written or something like that. And it's not your job to try to write some magnum opus or anything either. It's your job to complete the assignment given the instructions that you have. So you want to see what your professor actually wants out of the paper. Now, are there any other things that we could say about writing well? One of the key things in philosophy is clarity. And I think a lot of people in all across the range, so in analytic philosophy, in continental philosophy, in history of philosophy, they often, whether they realize it or not, come to rely upon jargon for clarity of exposition. Because, you know, we have terms that you know, have a particular meaning within this theory or that theory, and you know, they sort of cover a lot of ground with just a little bit of verbiage. But if somebody else doesn't know precisely what you mean by the jargon, then it's easy to mislead them. It's easy to take them off track. So if you're going to use jargon, it's probably a good idea to provide some sort of brief description of what you mean by it. You know, great example would be the term, you know, internalism versus externalism. That means a million different things across the field of philosophy, right? So you want to know what somebody actually means by that when they're using it. So jargon and how to handle it right is one thing. You probably, depending on what your writing process looks like, you probably want to outline what your paper should be doing. And if your instructors are like me, they really don't care much about the introduction or having a hook or anything like that. They want you to get to meat, to philosophical, body of the paper. What's going on? What are you actually going to talk about? Rather than coming up with some sort of snazzy intro thing. I mean, if they're into that and you can pull it off, that's good. But for the most part, we're interested in seeing content. We're interested in seeing that you understand the things that you're writing about, and you can talk about them in a coherent way. There's various ways to display to your instructor that you're really not only understanding the particular thinker, but that you can see multiple sides of an issue. So you might present, let's say we're doing something straightforward, right? What is Plato's doctrine of forms as you find it in the Republic? What are Aristotle's criticisms of the doctrine of the forms as you find it in Metaphysics Book 1? And then, evaluate whether Aristotle or Plato has it right. Okay, so first you got to present Plato's position. And you should present that as objectively as possible. Don't worry about giving your own views on it until you can establish that you really understand what Plato's point of view is. Give examples, show the connections between different passages or different ideas. And then, look at what Aristotle's criticisms are. You probably don't need to come up with every single one. He's got a number of different criticisms of the forms. Pick the top 3 that you think are the most cogent, right? And then after that, give your own view on the matter. And when you give your own view, make sure you explain why you take the position that you do. Everything in philosophy requires an answer to the question why. And it requires a fairly succinct answer to it as well. So that might be some useful advice. I don't know if that helps. The other thing is it's tempting to try to throw everything into a paper. You don't have to boil the ocean, as they say, when you're writing a philosophy paper. You don't have to incorporate every single thing into it. You can write another paper that deals with the stuff that you're thinking is really, really interesting. And you can submit that somewhere else and do it as a blog post or something like that. Will Cashmore writes, I'm taking tutorials in Hegel and Sartre at university next term. That's going to be fun, I think. I've been working through your half-hour Hegel series. Where would you recommend starting for Sartre? Okay, that's a good question. So there's a very basic, I guess you could call it an essay. It was actually an address that Sartre gave called Existentialism as a Humanism. That's a really good starting point. Don't take it as outlining everything about existentialism, but it is a pretty good representation of some of the key themes that Sartre is working on. Just like for Heidegger, right? What is Metaphysics doesn't have everything that Heidegger is thematizing, but it's got some of the key high notes of it. And then, you're probably going to be reading parts of Being and Time. So I would start digging into that. It's a very thick, long book. And I don't imagine if you're doing a tutorial on Sartre that you would actually read the entirety of Being and Nothingness. But it's good to read some of it. And, Sartre is also a novelist and playwright. So you probably want to read some of the plays. The plays are pretty easy reading, I think. And then there's, short stories and novels that are particularly apt for illustrating existentialist themes. The Wall is often anthologized. That's a nice short one. Nausea is kind of an interesting piece. I like it. A lot of people find it quite difficult to make sense of. There's also another one called The Age of Reason, which is probably a bit easier to read, and you can see a lot of Sartre's main themes being dealt with by the characters in there. So I would check those out. Katie says, have a BS, got it years ago. I will have the financial wherewithal to do grad school, but I know nothing about the process. I want to study Whitehead's Process and Reality, also McMurdy of Guelph. Well, there's not a lot of people doing work on Whitehead. So I think what you want to do in that case is, if you really want to study Whitehead, you're going to need to, and you want to do so through academic classes, you're going to need to find a place where he gets taught. And that means that you need to find somebody who specializes in Whitehead. So I don't know too many people out there who actually do work on him anymore. But I'm sure that you could easily, Google that and find some places at least. That's going to really narrow the scope of where you would look at going. The alternative would be, do a degree in philosophy. Don't expect to actually get a class specifically on Whitehead, but maybe do like an independent study with somebody in the faculty and do a lot of that research on your own. I don't know about too many other resources available online about Whitehead, but he's not somebody I've been reading for a long time. I was really fascinated by Process and Reality when I was an undergraduate. And process philosophy, was part of the American tradition with like Hartshorne and people like that when I was at Southern Illinois University, but I never really pursued it that much. So I don't know too much about who's doing, contemporary work on that. Murak asks, would you suggest a source to explain or help to understand Aristotle's prior analytics? I don't work on the prior analytics, so I don't really have any sources that I think would help. I do actually have a colleague at Marquette, Owen Golden, who works on the prior and posterior analytics, and he's very interested in logic, philosophy of science stuff. He might be somebody good to ask about that. Owen Golden, you could look him up on the Marquette faculty page, and not too difficult to find. But I don't know, because the work that I do on Aristotle is primarily on the ethical political works. So the two ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, parts of the topics, on the soul, a few other works as well. But I don't do too much with the logic stuff. Oh, here's a good one from Good Boy. How to pick a topic for PhD research. Should be something practical for something that I will get a stipend or what I really care about. For example, it's epistemology for me. So epistemology is not a topic. Epistemology is a whole field. How do we, how do we understand, you know, what the Stoics mean by prolepsis? That's a topic in epistemology. And how do you compare it against Epicurean views? And does it relate to innate ideas? That's a topic, right? I mean, when it comes to practical stuff, if that's your goal, then you probably want to look at fields like, say, applied ethics, or how, you know, theories about modeling, philosophy of technology, things like that. But you know, when you're writing a PhD dissertation in philosophy, you often begin with one topic, and then it winds up being something quite different that you're working on, right? You do have a few stages where in the initial research you have to write a prospectus and get it past your committee, but the whole process of research shouldn't just be, oh, I've got everything figured out now I just got to fill in the blanks. The process of research should involve you revising some of the things that you're doing. Now, you're not going to get a stipend for anything. You know, nobody's going to give you a stipend just because you're working on this topic or that topic, unless it's outside money. It's not going to happen from the university. If you know, and there's ways to get money out of, say, political groups. Like, let's say you're going to do, I'm going to do a dissertation on Ayn Rand, and you manage to find some person you could do it under. You could probably get some Randian to put up some money for that. But that's, you know, it's going to be because you come up with the conclusions that they like, right? Or maybe you get the Cato Institute to fund it, or Liberty Fund, or somebody like that. But that's not a very good way, I think, to do genuine research, right? That's what think tanks do. They've already got their conclusions ahead of time, and now they're just going to try to find some things to support it. So you know, if you do get funding, it's not going to be because of the topic that you're working on. It'll be because you're in a funded program, or you earned a fellowship or a scholarship or something like that. So I think those are two separate topics. How do you get funding for the PhD, and how do you decide what you want to research? The other thing to keep in mind is generally you're going to have to do research on something that an advisor could actually advise you about. So if you want to do something, say, on metaphor and its role in determining how we think about things, you need to be going to some place where there's somebody who specializes in that work, maybe somebody in semiotics or philosophy of language or something along those lines. That's part of the process as well. All right, Polar Chimes, what are some reasons for being a virtue ethicist that you find most compelling? I don't really choose the stances that I have because I have, you know, reasons for them that then lead me to that. I study things and I'm like, well, this seems to make the most sense. It provides some of the best explanations of things. Virtue ethics, it seems to jibe well with the sort of things that I observe about human beings and how we actually improve. And you know, there's a variety of different virtue ethics out there. By the way, people who aren't virtue ethicists talk about virtue. Kant, you know, has the metaphysical elements of virtue. That's the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is the groundwork for an actual work. The first part of which is the doctrine of virtue. John Stuart Mill, you know, a utilitarian, talks a lot about virtue as well. I just think that virtue ethics as a not sort of as an abstract schema, the sort of thing you find in textbooks, but virtue ethics as I find it in actual virtue ethicists like Aristotle or the Stoics, or you know, contemporaries like Alasdair MacIntyre. It's got a more powerful approach to things. You can integrate it better with psychotherapy. You can integrate it better with looking at things in terms of politics. And I think we do need to cultivate the virtues. So that's really what it comes down to for me. Pro foem, for us who are studying philosophy outside of school, are there any good online communities, forums, or Reddit pages that we can talk about our ideas on? Yeah, I mean, you're in a really unusual time period in that we do have the internet, and it opens up so many possibilities. There's a lot of great forums out there for all sorts of things, and sometimes they die out. They don't always remain super active. But if you just take, for example, Stoicism, right? There's a Facebook group, which is full of a lot of crap stuff, but there's also good discussions going on there as well. That has about 45,000 members. That's the large one. And then there's a smaller one for people who, in some respect, don't want to follow the moderation rules of the bigger one. That's got about 9,000 members, I think, at this point. And then there's, Applying Stoicism, which has 3,400 members, and there's others like that on Facebook. There's, of course, the Stoicism Reddit. I don't use Reddit much because it's I don't know, it's just not a great use of my time, but there's a lot of people doing work on things in Reddit. LinkedIn actually has a Stoicism group. Google Plus did, but of course Google Plus is going away. What else? There's a Yahoo forum for Stoicism, and I think that's got a lot of members. That's been around for quite a while. And then there's, particular groups that do that. And so what you can say about Stoicism, you can say about Epicureanism, you can say about Existentialism of various sorts, you can say about people who are interested in this person or this person or this person. There's all sorts of really great forums and groups out there that you can engage with other people on. Now, of course, you're going to have some jerks in there, but that's sort of anywhere you go, right? And then there's also face-to-face meetup groups. I would actually go on meetup.com and see, wherever you happen to be living, if there's any local groups that might be interesting for you. Because oftentimes those people will also be involved in online groups as well. So worth checking out, I would say. Alex asks, people have been talking about Deleuze. There we go. A lot of people have been talking about Deleuze these days. Any thoughts on him? Yeah, I talk about Deleuze. People ask me this almost every time I'm on here. I like Deleuze in some of his stuff, like The Logic of Sense. I like that. I like his essays, Critical and Clinical. I'm not big on the stuff he did with Guattari. I think a lot of Deleuzians are basically people who learned a kind of funny jargon and are trying to run with the ideas, but don't really know enough of the history of philosophy to do much with the connections that Deleuze has with it. He's worth studying, but he's when he does his history of philosophy, which I do like, you're getting more Deleuze than you're getting Leibniz or Spinoza or Bergson or whoever he's writing. Nietzsche, his Nietzsche book is quite fun as well. But yeah, he's worth checking out. I don't think that you need to become a Deleuzian and see rhizomes everywhere or something like that, but that's all right. Signor Pomodoro, do you think pursuing a career in philosophy is currently viable? I live in Arizona and I'm currently studying math, but I think I'm getting the call. So that's a great question. And that depends on what you mean by a career in philosophy. If what you mean is getting yourself a traditional academic position as a professor at some college or university, that's tough. I mean, the job market sucks. And it's really skewed to the people who have gone to the elite institutions. They monopolize the good jobs and have no compunction whatsoever about doing that. Many people wind up never finding a tenure track job. I've seen a lot of people who have gone from 1 year or 2 year position to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, moving all across the countryside until they finally get burnt out or can't find another position. Many people never get to do more than work as adjuncts. And working as an adjunct is okay if you have a side gig, if you have something else that you do. Like I work as an adjunct, but I also, have my own this YouTube channel, which supports Reason.io, which is tutorials and consulting and philosophical counseling and speaking and all of that sort of stuff. And so I'm not totally dependent on just adjunct work, which is unreliable and often doesn't pay very well and doesn't provide you with any sort of benefits. The people who are trying to make a living just as adjuncts, they have a very rough time. So if that's what you mean by a philosophy career, then you really have to do a sort of a probability assessment. What is the actual probability that you're going to get a job with that, an academic post? And it's kind of low. And the new positions that are being created often don't pay that well. Now, that's one way of thinking about a philosophy career. There's all sorts of other things that you can do outside of being a philosophy professor with a philosophy degree. And I think it's actually kind of weird that we think that unless you somehow get this, you win what we call the academic lottery, which is geared against you anyway, unless you went to Harvard or have rich parents or are doing some sexy topic or something like that. The notion that unless you manage to do that, you're somehow a failure or not really doing philosophy, that's kind of a weird, strange idea. And you could ask yourself, why does that keep getting replicated? I actually wrote a blog post about this not too long ago. I'm going to see if I can hunt it up while I'm talking about this. So what might you do with philosophy outside of teaching academic philosophy? Even within the academy itself, there's all sorts of other things that you might be doing. I mean, if it turns out that you're good at doing assessment, well, then you do assessment, right? And they'll pay you for doing that. Philosophy really connects up well with a lot of other disciplines. So I think it's quite good to think about other areas in the academy. Here we go. Okay? It's called A Strange Assumption About Philosophy. I'm going to put a link to it here in the stream. There's a lot of great positions that you can have that are much more enjoyable than teaching philosophy. And you can apply philosophy in a whole bunch of other ways. Tech companies and other places hire people with liberal arts degrees and often, specifically philosophy degrees, if they can show that they have certain skills. Some of those are being able to engage with other people and help them problem solve, because we philosophers are very good at making distinctions when they need to be made or figuring out how to explain something in other terms. You have to be able to communicate effectively in written and oral and sometimes even visual, like PowerPoint communication, if you want to deal with, say, business people or in the nonprofit sector or helping people in the arts. So there's a lot of work available in those sorts of areas, but we steer philosophy graduates away from that, and we tell them the essentially bullshit line that, oh, if you're doing that sort of thing, you're not really doing philosophy. We ignore the fact that throughout philosophy's history, many of the people who we read actually did that kind of work. They had day jobs, Great example would be Machiavelli. He was a city administrator in Florence, and then he'd go home at night and put on his robes and commune with Livy and write his stuff. Many people were not in the academy and they were doing philosophy just fine. And we live in a wonderful time. If you want to shoot a video about philosophy, you just shoot a video, right? You could do it from the camera on your computer. You could get yourself, a very cheap, like I have, a nice little GoPro and go to town. If you want to write books on philosophy, you can self-publish. I mean, if it's not good, maybe people won't buy it. But you can, we have this vast open sphere because of having the internet. You don't have to just do philosophy by finding yourself an academic position. So I think that's good to think about. Lou asks, what do you think about globalism and the general direction the world is headed? Well, I mean, the way that we're headed is killing ourselves by destroying the environment. So hopefully we'll change that. I don't know that globalism is necessarily going to lead to that change. That's in some respects more responsible for it. But globalism is one of those big, slippery terms that means all sorts of things. You know, can you be for or against globalism? Kind of, depending on what you mean by it. You know, what do you think of it? Well, I think that, you know, it's an ongoing process that's been intensifying in my lifetime, but had been going on for quite some time before that, and it's got a lot of good points to it. And it's got a lot of awful, terrible things to it as well. So that's what I would say. And let's see. On your Rudd, how do you deal with or counter nihilism / existentialism? I think this is really an important question to be addressed, given that religion is becoming less popular by the day thanks to science. Well, let's start by saying nihilism and existentialism are not at all the same thing. So you don't want to blur them together. And existentialism, it names a whole body of approaches. There's no one single thing that we call existentialism. Whatever some websites or videos may tell you. They're usually like drawing on, say, Sartrean existentialism. But Sartre was only one of many people, all of whom are equally important as he is, who used that term and who developed our conceptions of existentialism. Kierkegaard is very different than Sartre. Nietzsche is very different than Sartre. Lev Shestov, one of the first people to start seeing the connections, also Gord Brandes, a little bit earlier than him, between the higher, Gabriel Marcel, Simone de Beauvoir, Frantz Fanon. All these people are existentialists. They're not all doing exactly the same thing. Even Albert Camus, despite saying that he wasn't an existentialist, really is an existentialist because he fits within that broad pattern and has a lot of the same themes. And you can see that some existentialist philosophy is exactly responding to the problem of nihilism, right? Central problem for Nietzsche. Big problem that Kierkegaard saw on the horizon. Big problem for Shestov. Major issue for some of the existentialist literary thinkers like Rainer Maria Rilke or Franz Kafka, right? So, you know, you don't have to counter existentialism. As a matter of fact, existentialism may be how you counter nihilism. What's the answer to that? Well, you find meaning. The existentialists are not saying, oh, the world is totally deprived of meaning, so it's all crap. Throw up your hands in despair. They were actually quite optimistic, even the ones that seem pessimistic, saying, we're the human beings. We create meaning. Let's get on with the work. You know, let's not just take the meanings that are over here that seem to be. Let's make our own new meanings, right? Or let's draw upon the past and reinterpret it in productive ways that get us something. And this whole process of religion becoming less popular thanks to science. Well, that's been on for 300 years. That's the secularization project, but religion is also still around and going strong in many respects. Don't count it out quite yet. You know, science doesn't always rule out religion. I mean, science can't actually say much about quite a few things that are religious claims. So there's a lot going on there, I would say. Anonymous, why are people trying to control the social discussion? For a while, the Democrat and Republican Party have become more extreme. Why do I think this is happening? Is it because people are fractioning lives into smaller groups? Well, you know, I think you're right that the Republican Party has become more extreme. I don't see the Democrat Party, in my experience, becoming more extreme. I think that the hard left has always been out there. And as a matter of fact, most of them don't belong to the Democrat Party anyway. And the stuff that people, you know, say, oh, that's socialism or stuff like that about people on the left, it's, you know, if you actually look at it in a historical perspective, no, it's really pretty mainstream. What we've seen is it's rather been on the right in the last 20 years that the extreme has become where things have been centered. I mean, I'd say there's some issues, like for example, abortion, right, where Democrats have become more extreme. They've become sort of captivated by their own constituencies and rhetoric, but I think there's more when it comes to the Republican Party. You know, gun rights, for example, the NRA position and the Second Amendment position that's just sort of commonplace today. Back in the 1980s, when I was growing up, that would have been wackos who were saying that sort of stuff, and that was not the mainstream for Republicans. Actually, Republicans were for gun control back then. Now, is this because our lives are fractioning into smaller groups? No, I'd say actually these are bigger groups. I mean, Fox News viewers, who you can also sort of if you do statistical analyses, you can aggregate all these other things around them. They're a massive, pretty cohesive audience. The Democrats have been struggling to produce something like that on their own part for the last several elections, and not really succeeding in doing so, even during the Obama years. I would say that a lot of it, there's a lot of people on both sides who are pretty close-minded, and they don't know themselves very well. They don't spend a lot of time, examining human nature or issues of ethics, except in a very partisan way. And they don't listen to other people very much. They've already sort of demonized them. There's a lot of this on left and right. And there's also other areas of the spectrum where people are doing this. And it's really sad, because it leads to a lack of development on their part, which then, like you said, leads to people trying to control social discussion. Now, the controlling social discussion, that's not something new. That's been around for a very long time. And you're never going to get away from that. People are always going to be trying to control social discussion. The issue isn't whether they're trying to control social discussion. The issue is whether they're doing so in a boneheaded, stupid, uninformed way, or whether they're doing so in ways that are actually better informed. So it's not really freedom versus control. That's one sort of spectrum, right? But it's really sort of like poorly informed versus well informed, or doing so in good faith versus just striving to control everything for the sake of one's own power, right? Those are the differentiations that I look at. Pro Foem, does Nietzsche's thought support fascism in practice? I think he's more like an anarchist, since he thinks anyone could be an Übermensch, or is that wrong? Well, Nietzsche definitely doesn't think anyone could be an Übermensch. Most people aren't capable of that, because they are weak and give in and buy into society's nonsense, right? And it could be left-wing nonsense about Nietzsche hated socialism and democracy and this leveling tendency, or it could be right-wing nonsense, traditionalism for its own sake. I mean, traditionalism, conservatism, these are like slippery terms that mean something new every generation, which means you should be a bit suspicious of them. And they're just as subject to conformism, which Nietzsche hated, as anything else. Nietzsche would look at most of the people across the spectrum today and say, you're all a bunch of losers. None of you are Übermenschen, even though some of you may imagine yourself to be. I mean, does Nietzsche's thought support fascism? No, not really. I mean, I think he would have looked at historical fascism and said, man, these people are just filled with ressentiment. They figured out a way to mobilize some stuff. There may be a few interesting people among them, but for the most part, they're a bunch of conformist, know-nothing jerks. His work was used to try to support fascism, right? Especially as edited by his sister, Elizabeth Nietzsche, who definitely was a hardcore anti-Semite and who was a believer in German nationalism, right? But Nietzsche himself didn't buy into that sort of stuff. He says anti-Semites are a bunch of idiots. They're pathetic. And he's sort of you can think of as a sort of not a catalyst, like a corrosive agent, right? That allows you to scour a lot of crap off of things. So, all right. Mixalis asks, I'm writing a paper on Kant's Architectonic of moral duties, of right, of virtue, of love, respect. I checked your video lectures because I have trouble visualizing it. Any help? Well, if you're getting into stuff like love, respect, virtue, you got to go beyond the groundwork for the metaphysics of morality and get into the actual metaphysics of morality, where you'll have the doctrine of virtue, right? And you could get into the social philosophy and the metaphysical elements of justice. So I don't have video lectures on that stuff. And you might also check out some of his other writings. I mean, you definitely want to also check out the second critique, which is nice and short as well. It's not like the first critique, which takes forever to read. A second critique is actually decently short, and that'll help you out. But I don't have any video lectures on that material, unfortunately. All right, Mr. Big Weak Knee. Do I believe that pure mathematics are analytic or synthetic? So we're talking about just mathematics apart from any of its applications, the fields that we include, things like geometry, once we've managed to suck it into mathematics after people like Descartes, number theory, topography, linear algebra, calculus, all these sorts of things that we fit into the field of mathematics. Are they purely analytic or synthetic? I mean, I never really think in these categories anyway myself. But if I had to, I guess I would say that some of the stuff that we find in mathematics is purely analytic, and then there is some stuff where, maybe we are finding things that don't completely fit. They're not contained. The subject is not completely contained in the predicate, or however we want to think about it. There's some sort of productive process there. You think about like complex analysis, or some of these really interesting developments that we have in extending mathematical theory, like Cantor's theory of transfinite numbers. But again, I don't usually use this distinction to make sense out of things. Let's see here. John Ortiz, do I have any conceptual tools to better understand a philosophy text? I mean, both in general, philosophy of science, but also specific. Well, I don't do philosophy of science, so I don't have anything to say about that. Yeah, I mean, for any philosophy text, figure out, who the audience actually is. There's always rhetorical stuff going on within the text. You want to sort of assemble for yourself a picture of what it is that the is trying to provide you with. Don't get bogged down in the sort of gotcha, oh, you're wrong about this, so the whole thing falls apart kind of thing. Try to see where the author's actually going with stuff. Remember that understanding is much more important than agreement or even appreciation. Although, eventually down the line, you'll want to figure out whether you do agree with it or not. But first, you have to understand it. What else? I mean, when it comes to most important authors, some of their major works can be read, in their own right and understood, but oftentimes it helps to read more of that author. So for example, Descartes' Meditations, I was really surprised to find out when I posted some of the more recent videos about that, because I'm teaching it in my classes, that a lot of people only read Meditation 1 and 2. And they do that because their professor only assigns Meditation 1 and 2. And I was like, why the hell would you only read, the first third of the book? I mean, you can't figure out what he's actually trying to do until you get to around Meditation 4, It makes perfect sense why people would be obsessed with the evil genius of Meditation 1 and 2, because they don't realize that that's been ruled out by the time we get to Meditation 3 and 4, let alone 5 and 6. And reading just the meditations by themselves, while it's quite good, if you want to understand Descartes' larger project, you need to read the Discourse on Method, and it probably wouldn't hurt to take a look at the Principles of Philosophy, although very few people do. But you definitely want to read his correspondence with Princess Elizabeth and the book that emerged from that, On the Passions of the Soul, to get an idea about what he means by emotions and how they work. So that's part of it. You know, you don't just read the philosophy text just as an isolated thing. Now, obviously, some authors, we only have one book by them, so what are you going to do? You can't find any more stuff. Or we have very little of their work, like unfortunately Epicurus. But that's part of it. You know, I would say too, you want to try to think about the world and yourself and human relations, and what the author, the framework that they're giving you, what the world, what yourself, what you know, your relations to others would actually look like through the lens of that author. And try to think of examples that you might use as well. All right, Valdemar, if you've read Simplicius's commentary on Epictetus's Enchiridion, what do you think of it? It's okay. I have read it. You know, I read it when I was doing work on Epictetus and what he means by proairesis. I think sometimes Simplicius gives you some interesting things, but you know, Simplicius is not himself a Stoic, so he doesn't really have a stake in like getting Epictetus right in terms of his own, you know, Stoicism. I don't think he gets proairesis right. I think he reverts back to the older Stoic position of proairesis is just a hierasis before a hierasis. And he ignores the absolute centrality of it in Epictetus's work. But it's, you know, it's an interesting thing. It's worth checking out. Eon Sphere. Really sad about the Google Plus apocalypse. Yeah, it's so today's the 29th. By next week, Google Plus will have gone away altogether. And it's too bad because I have I've been using Twitter, Facebook, Google Plus, and LinkedIn for years and years, and I have different connections to people depending on what medium that they're on. And I actually get, you know, some of the stuff that I like reading or checking out through Google Plus, and it's going to go away. And I didn't make the switch to MeWe because I don't really feel like having another social network. I have enough, you know, to do as it is, just with the ones that I have already. But it'll be a loss. It's too bad that Google didn't support it. And you know, this is a broader topic. Going back to the globalization thing, right? We can, you know, we talk about globalization as being this process of, you know, like we're connected with China, and, you know, the Chinese social, what is it called? Not social capital. Their network might, you know, eventually intrude into our way of doing things, and you know, what happens in the EU affects us, and all of that. That's quite true. Although we tend to more throw our weight around than have weight thrown around on us. But another aspect of globalization we can talk about is the massive influence that these giant tech companies have over our ways of relating to each other and doing work. And so, you know, Google decides to or doesn't decide to support one of their products that people get into has very massive implications, you know. And that's something that I think we don't devote a lot of attention and thought to until it's too late, right? All right, Reyes, are there any Spanish philosophers besides Ortega y Gasset that you know of or can recommend? Yeah, Miguel de Unamuno is somebody who's well worth reading. Somebody else who's an existentialist, by the way, along with Ortega y Gasset. He's not writing in Spanish, but he is a Spanish-American philosopher, George Santayana, definitely worth reading as well. And in phenomenology, Maria Zambrano is somebody quite interesting. You know, did a lot of work on dreams and images and things like that. Nobody else really comes to mind for me, unless you're talking like further back about these Iberian philosophers in the after the Middle Ages, like John of Poisson. You know, he's an interesting person, but he's not really Spanish, right? In the modern sense, I'm sure there's a lot of people doing very interesting work in Spanish philosophy, but unfortunately I don't read Spanish. So I only read things in translation, and I don't have a lot to offer on that point. All right, EDO, what one book or series of books would you recommend for a person that's self-studying and wants a good overview or introduction to philosophy? Well, I don't read a lot of these popular introductions to philosophy. I would say, it can't hurt to read it, so long as you don't believe that he's actually got things right. Bertrand Russell is a good stylist. He'll introduce you to some people. He's often wrong in his assessments of different philosophers, so don't believe the stuff that he says, but it's a good starting point. Same thing with Will Durant and the story of philosophy, right? He tells a great story. Unfortunately, large parts of it are false. I guess Anthony Kenny has a book out recently. I haven't taken a look at it because I don't read these things, right? When I have my students engaging with philosophical texts, I'm not giving them an intro to philosophy textbook. I have them read Plato and Aristotle and Epictetus, and we talk about it in class. So I don't do too much of that. There is a book by this guy Stumpf that people like, that we used when I was an undergraduate, called Socrates to Sartre. It's not bad, you could check that out. If you want something a bit more like grounded and actually getting you into the text, Friedrich Cobbleston's History of Philosophy, which is like a whole set of volumes, that's pretty reliable. Cobbleston usually won't steer you wrong, and he's pretty comprehensive in what he covers. That was something that we used when I was in graduate school to try to get a idea about what's going on. Yeah, so that I think that probably answers that. Ritz Vic, where to start studying logic? Just get yourself an intro to logic textbook and start doing it. They're all the same, right? Because all the stuff doing formal logic is all basically the same stuff. I particularly like Irving Kopy, who was a great logician in the 20th century, in part because he's very thorough and he leads you through all the different things. Other people like Hurley. There's more recent approaches. Kopy has some more advanced stuff where he's looking at the foundations of logic, and he does, I think, a pretty good job. But that would be after you've been studying it for a while. The other person I'll mention, who you can find his book usually at used bookstores fairly cheaply, is Lewis Carroll. He has this Lewis Carroll Symbolic Logic, and I think, if I remember right, it didn't come out in his own time. People put this together out of his notes, but it's a different approach. Carroll actually was, Lewis Dodgson was a dean of logic, and he taught that stuff, and it's fun stuff to work with. So I would check that out as well. All right, Kate Joost, I've started on my journey into Heidegger and feel like I finally found my philosophical direction. I've got Polt's introduction. I'm also busy with the history of the concept of time. Any other essays or companions you found helpful? I don't use essays or I don't use companions, right? I go to the primary text. So if I want to know what Heidegger says about something, I read Heidegger. You're definitely going to want to get his basic writings, which has, in addition to like the Introduction to Being and Time, it's got some really classic essays like The Question Concerning Technology, or What is Metaphysics, or The Origin of the Work of Art. Those are sort of touchstones, you could say. Sooner or later, you're going to want to read Being and Time. And I think there's companions out there for that, but again, I don't read them, so I can't say much about that. He also has another work that's really quite interesting. Heidegger has a lot of lectures, and some of his lectures are more interesting than others. The one that's assembled together, called The Basic Problems of Phenomenology, that's quite good. That's pretty interesting. You got to know some Kant to be able to understand what he's saying, but otherwise, it's decent stuff. I wouldn't make the end goal for studying Heidegger Being in Time. I think you should, you should make that like your middle goal, rather, right? All right, let's see here. FGH, do I think that paganism of ancient Greece and Rome has any metaphysic, or it's a bunch of stories for plebs? It's in between. I mean, there's definitely a metaphysic involved or implicit in stories. It may not be a coherent metaphysic. There were philosophers who tried to make sense out of these things. So like the Stoics, for example, develop an allegorical approach to mythology, which then gets used by later Jewish and Christian authors to make sense out of their texts. Yeah, that's probably enough to say about that. I mean, there are some interesting treatments, like Cicero, for example, has this view on religion, where most of the religion is basically for the plebs to keep them in line, give them something to do, something to occupy themselves with. The philosopher who actually understands things, they don't believe in all this BS that the ordinary people do. So that, you know, that's a common thread that comes up, I'd say. Arturo, do I have any tips for students that have bad grammar or usage issues when writing philosophy pages? Well, you've got grammar check on most word processors now, so that can be helpful. Have somebody proof check your work. Get a friend, and if you have to like trade them something, like I'll make you a meal or give you a back rub if you proofread my essay, get them to do it, right? That's one way to do it. I mean, improving your own grammar would probably help. That can be done not just by like studying grammar, but by reading good literature. That can help you out. Yeah. Moonchild asks if I heard of the poem John Keats. What I think of English Romanticism. Yeah, I've heard of Keats, and I read him long ago, but I don't remember much. English Romanticism. I mean, I'm not really that into Romanticism per se. In part, there's certain figures, like I like Mary Shelley, right? But you know, they're doing different stuff than I was really into. It's an important movement and period, but it's just not something that I'm all that attracted to, I have to say, you know. Okay, Robert says, insightful stuff about academic philosophy. These days you have to be very strategic about it. Go to UCLA, work with their superstars, get a PhD from Princeton, sad but true. Yeah, I mean, you know, the elite institutions, they tend to bogart most of the available good positions and postdocs and all that kind of stuff. And that's just the way it works. I mean, academia is not any different than any other field where those who belong to the elite tend to self-reproduce through a variety of different cultural means. And there's sort of a ideology of meritocracy that serves them, but actually is completely false. And there's enough little openings for token people to get in from lower classes, or if we want to think about it in terms of, you know, gender and race, like in philosophy, which is very white and very, very male. There's enough openings. Actually, people bend over backwards now in jobs to hire women and minorities. You'll actually see that in job descriptions. EOC candidates are especially encouraged to apply. And I've seen on hiring committees where they're like, got to interview a woman, got to interview somebody who's a person of color. Usually, unfortunately, that's kind of window dressing. They don't actually plan to hire them. Yeah, the job market really kind of sucks. Very alienating for people to go through. Not great for people's mental health. All right, Diogenes says, felt like I should share first person to get full marks on a philosophy essay at my sixth form on why men should have authority of women in a Christian society. Okay, congratulations on getting full marks. Hopefully it's not because you actually believe in that, but you made a good argument or something. Profem on philosophers who did other jobs. Let's not forget the long history of artist philosophers. I myself do comics and study Hegel. Philosophy is flexible. Yeah. Dostoevsky is, you know, a lot of his characters are doing philosophy. They're talking philosophy, right? That's why we include him in the existentialist canon. And there's all sorts of other people as well. FGH, have I read Shorin or Sioran? If I have, what do I think of his work? Haven't read him. I've read a few glosses on him. That's about it. So not something I'm going to get to anytime soon. Kyle Fonda, I'm thinking about attending grad school in France. My skill level in French is good, but I'm worried that the vocabulary and philosophy will be very difficult for a non-native speaker. Well, then you better start reading a lot of French philosophy, right? So that probably would be the thing to do. The only way you're going to get used to it is to study it, to read the people who are doing that. And if you've read these texts too, it's also going to be good because the professors might be referring to them, and then you've got some sort of touch points where as you get tired and you can't pay quite as close attention, you can at least know where they're going with things. Stu, NPG, thoughts on the Jordan Peterson versus Zizek debate? I don't care anything about it, quite frankly. I don't have much good to say about Jordan Peterson. Zizek is interesting sometimes, but I don't pay very close attention to him, in part because I'm often not all that rewarded by spending the time to make my way through his stuff. I've devoted time to it in the past. I really couldn't care less what these two do with each other. I don't think much interesting or important stuff is going to come out of it. And it's pretty rare, I think, that debates actually do anything important other than consolidate their fan bases and draw attention to things. I guess it's a good thing in that people will be talking about philosophy, but then maybe we can get to more important and more interesting stuff, for example, what do I think of Andrew Yang and his idea of a universal basic income, $1,000 a month for every citizen? I'm actually a fan of the universal basic income idea, and I'm a fan of funding it by raising the taxes on the super rich. I think that they've gotten away with paying way less than their fair share for a very long time. And quite frankly, the Republicans are going to be totally against that, and most of the Democrats will be as well because they're in the pockets of the rich, or they belong to the rich. I mean, take Barack Obama, for example. He may have been a community organizer at one point. He quit being that a long, long time ago. He's now within the super rich, right? If you think that he somehow has anything in common with you or me or ordinary people, you're just deluding yourself. Any of these people who have managed to enrich themselves by getting, $250,000 paid speaking engagements or writing books that sell, millions of copies or any of this sort of stuff, they have no connection with you whatsoever and don't care about you at all, other than sort of props in their own little world. So I'm cool with stuff like a universal basic income that would actually improve the lives of many people. And I don't even care about the fact that a lot of people would spend it on bullshit stuff. I think it's a great thing to do. I don't know that Yang is the best person for proposing it. I'd like to see other people doing it as well. But I don't know enough about him to really have that much of an opinion. What I've seen so far, I haven't been super impressed with. And some of the issues that he seems to be particularly fascinated by, like male circumcision, I don't really care, I know that when it was up to me, I didn't feel like I was part of some oppressed male class or something like that when they were asking whether my son should be circumcised or not, right? And there's some really weird stuff out there, and I don't think that, by the way, I don't think that male circumcision is even remotely close to forced female circumcision, because you're not cutting off a major part of the sexual organ. And people who want to say that those are somehow the same thing, I call bullshit on that. That's a sign that I'm dealing with somebody who's kind of nutty, and which doesn't mean they're not reasonable about other things, but on that's nutty. We'll see what happens with Yang. The nice thing about this process is that he's going to now undergo super scrutiny, just like every other Democratic candidate. And then we'll have to go to the primaries, and we'll see if he has any legs in the primaries. Usually what ends up happening is 2 or 3 candidates become the major front runners. Everybody else is so trailing behind that the only thing that they can possibly do is figure out who they're going to trade their votes to for some party platform plank stuff. So that could be interesting. All right, Katie, please use Democrat Party not to be a grammar Nazi is incorrect. Oh, I don't care. I'm going to keep saying what I say, and you are being a grammar Nazi with that. Man, there's so many other things to be concerned about. If you're here on my stream, if you don't understand what I'm saying, then I don't know what to tell you about that. All right, Cody Lee, have I read contemporary philosopher Stephen Hicks' work explaining postmodernism, socialism from Rousseau to Foucault? If so, what are your thoughts? I've actually met Stephen Hicks because every once in a while I go down and give lectures on Stoicism at Rockford University, hosted by his institute. Of course, it's at considerable odds with the stuff that he's into. I think that his take on postmodernism, I haven't read the book, but I've read glosses on it. I think he's wrong. I mean, it's unfortunate that Peterson has relied upon this. I think most people who use the word postmodernism don't have a clue about what they're talking about. For me, if you want the best book on understanding what postmodernism is, then you want Friedrich James's Postmodernism, which is a big, thick book, and it talks about a number of different, versions of postmodernism and where it came from. But a lot of what people call postmodernism is exactly what 100 years ago they were calling modernism. This notion, well, there are no absolutes anymore, tear everything down, and that's all nonsense. So, and especially the thing with associating it with, in particular, with Marxism. Samuel Harrington is a great person. He wrote this wonderful book, The Politics at God's Funeral. Harrington is an example of an actual Marxist. Terry Eagleton, an actual Marxist. Alistair McIntyre, actual Marxist. All 3 of them actually attacked postmodernism of their own time for getting too far away from class and struggle for the proletariat and all this sort of stuff. They said it was an elite phenomenon, So, that's quite important. Mr. Big Weekney, there were many Republicans who were in favor of socializing parts of healthcare in the 80s. Yeah, there's lots of Republicans who have radically lost touch with the tradition of their party. I mean, here's another issue. It quit being the party of Lincoln when it started becoming racist, and this was long before into the Southern strategy in the 1970s, right? When they started embracing a kind of genteel racism in the early part of the 20th century, they quit being the party of Lincoln. I actually found out, very interestingly, this state, Wisconsin, we were one of the most progressive states in the 1800s. This is where the radical Republicans took off. It was an anti-slavery state. The Dred Scott decision has to do with, Dred Scott escaping to Racine. And the governor of this state, the 6th governor, who I'm actually doing some historical research on, he actually planned and proposed to have Wisconsin secede from the Union if Lincoln was not elected. It wasn't just the southern states who were like, this is BS, we're getting out of here if we don't get our way. It was the North, too. Places like this. The Republicans of today have zero living off of his image. Yeah, Republicans have changed radically since our time, growing up. And it's a pretty dark direction that they've taken. I don't trust them for anything. I used to consider the left much more of a problem and danger, and I was pretty anti them. Now I see the Republicans and the American right as where the real danger lies. So yeah. All right, Robert Smith, but aren't SJWs extreme? If you disagree, they try to get you fired. So Evergreen State. Evergreen State is such an exception to the rule. Man, you could walk down the halls at Marquette and talk whatever conservative stuff you want, and most people are not going to bat an eye. Or if they do, maybe they'll wonder what you're talking about, right? This notion that somehow evergreen state is the norm, that's extreme, you know? I mean, all you need to do to figure that out is go spend some time at a number of college campuses and see what it's actually like. SJWs are powerful in some places, like you said, and that power at least is new. They're powerful. Most places they're actually not, you know. Some SJWs are extreme, some aren't. Some are, you know, I mean, I think by some people's standards, I would be considered an SJW, right? Because I think, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft was right about feminism, that men and women really ought to be afforded exactly the same opportunities. And that sometimes that means that we have to say women have been screwed over, so we're going to give them extra opportunities right now, you know? I think for some people, that would be enough to place me in the SJW camp. But that's just a sign of like this black and white kind of thinking about these matters, you know? All right, ionosphere. Gun rights were seen as extreme in the 80s for many reasons, because it being a healthy state, just contrast it with the height of government corruption they had then, and it doesn't make sense. I'm not sure what you mean, the height of government corruption they had in the 80s. I mean, we have a lot of government corruption now. I mean, I just have to go south to the city of Chicago, and we have a police force that's totally out of control and has been out of control for decades, and routinely lies about things. The city itself is run by a Rahm Emanuel, you know, who's a great example of a machine Democrat, you know, somebody who doesn't care about anybody other than the people who put him in power. I don't know what you mean by the 80s were somehow more corrupt than today. Yeah. All right, Tatiana. Hey, Greg, here's another academic trying to use YouTube as a teaching space. Any way we could connect to discuss YouTube and academia? Yeah, you email me. I mean, it's easy enough to find my email on Reason.io or like everywhere else. That's usually how people get in touch with me. Some people do it through Facebook. Some people do it through YouTube. But sure, yeah, go ahead and send me something about what you're interested in doing. FGH, have you read any theories that go against the theory of evolution, like theories of involution, which say the exact opposite? I don't know what the exact opposite of evolution would be. What, that it's sort of like, you know, when we deal with bizarro land, you can't really have bizarro land where like yes means no and up means down and all this, because sooner or later you have to have some baseline where then we have the opposition, you know, following from that. What would be the opposite of a theory of evolution? Would you retain the, you know, passing on genetic characteristics and struggle for survival and adaptation and stuff like that? And which things would you take out or reverse? Or would you say that like everything gets worse and worse? I don't even know what that would mean. So yeah. All right. Anirud. Thanks, Mr. Sadler. I've been following your work for a while. Find them very interesting. Please continue. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'll be continuing. I have no plans to stop. This has been a kind of slow month for me, in part because my wife and I were trading illnesses the first part, and I'm still teaching a lot of classes, and now my kids have been here for the last almost week, so I haven't gotten that much done, but I plan to keep on churning out videos and getting back into it, especially in the summer. General Lee, do I know anything about John Walton on the Genesis, creation, and interpretations in the ancient Near Eastern context? The name sounds familiar, but I don't know. Is he doing comparative work in mythology or something? That could possibly be how I encountered it. Let me look at the next one. So, and I'm gonna have to wrap up in about 5 minutes or so. My kids and I are going to take the Milwaukee streetcar, which is free right now, being sponsored by the casino. We're going to ride it and then go down to the lake and hang out for a bit. All right, Patrick says, any recommendation on how to approach meaning and time, being in time? Well, it's a big, thick book, right? And Heidegger is using a lot of terminology, some of which he's drawing from the tradition and some of which he's creating himself, and some of which he's like immediately employing without telling you what it means, like, you know, ontic versus ontological, right? And you're like, what the hell is this stuff, right? So what I would say is, you know, you try to read your way through it. And if you want to use secondary lit, or, you know, I've got videos on the introduction of Being in Time that might be helpful. You use that sort of thing and try to get through as much of it as you can, and then like go back and start again, right? And don't expect to understand everything along the way. I mean, you can say the same thing for Sartre's Being in Nothingness, or Hegel's Being in Time, or even shorter works like Descartes' Meditations, or Plato's, you know, Republic. Expect to read and reread. That's just par for the course when it comes to philosophy work. General Lee writes, sad that we have this great platform, yet there are just a bunch of LARPers and political edgelords. You know, I've been kind of fortunate in that I haven't encountered all that much of that, but I also tend to, when I get, you know, comments on my videos that I think are kind of jerky, whether it's from the left or the right, I often just remove them and sometimes just ban the person, because I'm like, they don't need to be here. And I don't spend too much time like going out into other people's videos. When I do and I look at the comment streams, I'm like, holy crap, is this stuff toxic, you know? Even when I like looking at, you know, music videos from metal bands that I'm into, and, you know, you read down and people are like so mean to each other, right? And so yeah, we don't do that much with that. I actually joke with my students sometimes too about like what we do with the internet in general. And I said, imagine that we have like aliens come here and they've been observing us for a long time, and they're like, okay, they're doing the Industrial Revolution. All right, they've got like, you know, radio. Oops, you know, they set off atomic weapons. Oh, they're doing this or that. And then imagine they get to the point where like, oh, look, they've got this massive intercommunication network. They call it the internet or the World Wide Web. This is really great because now they're going to make all this scientific progress, and everybody's going to be able to know about, you know, humanity, and they'll be able to use it as this great research tool, and it's going to connect them together. And then they come down here and they're like, we're ready to reveal ourselves to you. And then they start looking at what we actually do with the internet, and they're like, we're so disappointed in you. And we're like, what are you disappointed in? And they're like, well, you've got this great internet thing, and what you use it for, where the greatest bandwidth is buying and selling crap, porn, and gaming. You know? That's what you're using your bandwidth for primarily. What the hell's wrong with you as a species? You know. But you know, that's that, right? Jared Jenkins writes, question about Boethius. It looks like there's going to be quite a few questions I'm just not going to be able to get to. Is Boethius essential for medieval scholastic philosophy? Yeah, he actually is. He's not just somebody who's important to read for the history of philosophy and because he's great to read for his own sake, but Boethius's commentaries on like Aristotle's categories and his translations too were very important for people from Anselm and Abelard onward into scholasticism. So you'll see, for example, Thomas Aquinas bringing him up. I'm not, you know, I don't read that much of later scholastic philosophy, so I don't know how often they refer to Boethius, but I'm sure there's some of that. So I think that's good to think about. We're at 3:29, so I'm going to skip ahead. Riley Waugh, isn't it the case that most philosophy departments in the U.S. are overwhelmingly analytic? Why is this the case, and is this an issue? I wouldn't say most of them are. I would say it's more like, say, 65% probably, and a lot of them are pluralistic, which means that they have some analytics, some people doing history of philosophy, some people doing continental, some people doing other stuff. Why is this? Well, because analytic philosophy was a sort of sexy research program that caught on, and also there's a back history of them like aggressively promoting it. Like I remember back when I was a graduate student, I couldn't go to DePaul, which was one of the places I applied to, because the analytics and continentals couldn't get along, fought with each other. The Continentals pushed all the analytics out of the department. They no longer had enough faculty to offer a PhD in philosophy. Southern Illinois University, the analytics had tried to push the American and continental philosophers out of the philosophy department for years and years before I got there. So there was a lot of aggressiveness, a lot of like, you're not doing real philosophy, you're doing poetry instead, or crap like that. It's not really like that so much these days. It's more like analytic philosophers, for the most part, just don't learn how to do other approaches. And so they have no idea what they're encountering when they run into somebody who's doing, classical American philosophy or continental stuff or history of philosophy or things like that. Let's see, what else can I take here very quickly? Here we go. Subconscious qualms. Do I think philosophy has more in common with the sciences or literature? Depends on whose philosophy. There's no standard agreed upon consensus definition of philosophy. There's many ways of doing it. Some are more oriented towards the sciences. And you could say, well, what sciences? Natural sciences? Yeah, some of them. Social sciences? Yeah, some of them as well. Of course, the natural sciences and social sciences also came out of philosophy historically. Literature, yeah, some are more oriented towards that. Some are more oriented towards other things. So there's no easy way to answer that. Andreas asked if I read the Spheres trilogy by Peter Sloterdijk. I haven't read Peter Sloterdijk yet. I hope to get to him someday. That would be nice. All right, let's see here. What else can I take here? Oh, here's a good one. Any tips for reading difficult texts or books while not feeling like it when you're quickly distracted or being sleepy? Do you need to read on these days to train your reading muscle? Well, you can't do too much, right? And I've had that experience myself where you're like, you have the same page in front of you and your eyes are going across it, and you realize you've just been like sort of like a horse going through its plowing, and you're like, what the hell did I just read? I don't remember any of this. And then what I do is I stop and I go back and I start rereading it. But some days you just can't make progress, right? Like with Hegel, for example. There are some days when I pick up Hegel's phenomenology and I'm like, I'm going to shoot a video on it. I'm going to start putting stuff on the board. And I'm reading it and I'm like, what the hell is this crap? I can't make any sense of it. Well, then that day I can't read Hegel. I got to do something else instead. So then I pick up some Descartes or, do work on the Stoics or something else. And I think with some philosophers, it's tougher to read them than others. Sometimes it's because they're boring and dry. Sometimes it's because there's an intrinsic difficulty to what they're doing. So I would say, just, find the best time of the day for reading and set that aside and use that as your time and space for that. And, you don't have to try to read everything and understand everything. It's enough to get some progress and then make a little bit more progress and make a little bit more progress. So, all right, let's see. I'm going to scroll down and see what else we got. So here's an interesting question. Should complex philosophy be forced by law to speak in simple declarative sentences? No, I mean, nobody should be forced by law for that, right? You certainly could try to do something like that. And that would probably be like Newspeak in 1984. And that's not going to convey very much, right? Why is it that you follow up? Why is it complex philosophers writing long, complex sentences? Because reality is complicated. I mean, there's no way around that. I mean, you can have a nice, simple formulation, but it's going to be false, right? So if you wanted to do justice to the complex reality that we live in and the complex reality that we are, that's just the way it's going to be. And you can complain about it, or you can, try to rise to it as best as you can. Vathanak asks, any plans to do a video about Levinas? None in the immediate future. Somebody was asking me about that last week. I do commissioned videos, so if somebody really, really wants me to do stuff, they can hire me to do core concept videos. Some people did that with Heidegger a while back. But I mean, I'm not teaching Levinas in any of my classes. And the priority for right now is shoot video stuff on the things that I can use in my classes for my students. Levinas is somebody quite interesting. I like him. I don't like Levinasians much, I have to admit, because they're always like, oh, you're effacing the other, we're all hypocrites, you know. There was this shtick that they did back in the 1990s that you got like sick of after a while. I actually dated a Levinasian for a while too, and man, was that boy, did that shtick get old quick, you know. So yeah, let's see. Let me see if I can take one more thing very quickly. And then I'm going to head out and get on the road a little bit. Well, here's an interesting thing from Aeon Sphere. It may seem like we're more corrupt now, and that may be true on the grand scale, but at the local level, we the people have more say now, and the likelihood of our issues being seen and addressed have drastically increased. You know, I would say that in a lot of cases that's quite true. And in part, that's because of the social media. You can put stuff on Twitter and be like, this is an outrage. And people will be like, really? It's an outrage? Let me take a look at it. You know, and then they'll spread it as well. I don't know that it always changes things. You know, you look at some of these things that we, you know, for example, one of the reasons why Ferguson was having such bad race relations was because they were actually having bad class relations, because the city was set up to be predatory in its fining and jailing of people, and it was really falling hard on the poor. It was actually part of their revenue stream for the city, and that should just be criminal. Treating people like that as just mere you know, things to farm. It may as well be the Matrix, except it's the city administrators as the machines and all these poor people getting sucked everything out of them. And it happened to coincide with race and other things. And it didn't change right away. I mean, all these protests and stuff like that, it took the DOJ like actually coming in and looking at it and having a report, and it's still not a great place, you know? Frankly, if I lived in Ferguson, I'd get the hell out of there, you know? We have a lot more opportunities, I would say, for organizing and for getting information out there. And so maybe we can attack corruption more easily that way. But man, it seems like there's an endless stream of it. And when it comes to things like the Chicago, you know, police, there's not a lot of progress being made. They're still, you know, holding people without charging them in secret locations. We're constantly finding revelations about how they abuse their power. The mayor doesn't seem to really care much. People are organizing and protesting. I follow some of them because I care about this issue. But it's very difficult to get much done about it. And when it comes to the larger political process, it's hard to see how you would actually manage to stay in it without being corrupted by it, you know, especially in a state like Illinois, for example. But even here in Wisconsin, we've got our problems that way too. All right, so I'm going to call it a day and end this broadcast, probably trim off the first front of it when the sound stuff wasn't working right. Thanks for everybody for your questions and comments. And we'll do 2 of these next month as usual. I'll figure out what the theme will be. We do one on Facebook Live, one on YouTube Live. We'll have the AMA as well. So you can, you know, watch the Reason I.O. events calendar for that, or, you know, also have the update video talking about that as well. So all of you have a great afternoon if you're here in this hemisphere, or evening or morning or whatever it is, wherever you happen to be. And I'll see you next month.